Well, Dave Baumken, I'd like to thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed on the topic of resilient critical infrastructure.
That's my pleasure, Dave.
Thanks.
So just to introduce myself to others that may be watching that, my name is Dave Baumken. I am an electricity professional. I spent a total of 40 years in the electricity industry. Started at a very young age and am now retired and have been since 2017 from Hydro One and its subsidiaries. I've been teaching critical infrastructure protection or managing risk to critical infrastructure. There's two courses, one at the undergrad and one at the graduate level. And I've been doing this since 2011. I'm a graduate of the York University's master's program in disaster and emergency management. My field is also computers. So I started out in the computer technology field back in the late 70s, and you never lose that kind of, expertise, although it has evolved very quickly over the years. And I got out of that field actually in the year 2000. I was splitting my time by doing work on the Y2K, doing satellite technology and building SQL servers. So they asked me at that time to take over the project for the Y2K, Y2K being the planning leading up to the rollover. And I liked the work so much that I decided to stay with it. So I stayed with that for the next 17 years, developing emergency management programs, disaster type scenarios to go along with that. I also did the business continuity planning. Today, I'm a consultant and as well as teaching at York University. And my specialty is on threat, risk, vulnerability, and resiliency assessments.
So I wonder if you could start off by telling us a bit about your general approach to resilience in critical infrastructure.
I'll give you a little bit of history, and that's not something I talk much even in my courses about history. This is a relatively new term when you talk about critical infrastructure. In fact, critical infrastructure itself became more in the minds of people leading up to the Y2K rollover. But more importantly, Canada's national strategy for critical infrastructure. And that was released in mid-2010. And one of the major components of that national strategy is resiliency. And resiliency as defined, and there's many different definitions for resiliency. So obviously the one I want to share with you is the one that Public Safety Canada put forward on critical infrastructure resiliency. So not verbatim to what is in the plan or the strategy, but basically it's the ability to adapt and recover from. So it's all about being flexible and to absorb the effects. And why this is important is because you can't necessarily protect from every type of natural or human-made disaster, including accidents. So resiliency became a major focus for critical infrastructure entities in Canada shortly after the national strategy was released. Prior to that, the word resiliency really wasn't on our minds in the business world, in the critical infrastructure, certainly in my role at Hydro One. And you might find that surprising. But it was just the term itself, the explicitness of resiliency. We often talked about protection, and certainly protection was something we were very, very concerned about in the early days of cyber, which is now more commonly known as digital. So in the early 2000s, we were getting hit with a lot of computer viruses and things like that, not hacking in the terms of the way things are going on now. So protection was actually possible if you put in certain levels of standards. So the only time we really talked about resiliency was when we talked about the fact, and we didn't actually say it at that, but governments then, as they do now, say that people, their citizens, need to be prepared for 72 hours. And that's really resiliency when you look at it. And not much has changed in that today. Governments are really, really concerned that the people can take care of themselves for the first 72 hours. So therefore be resilient, be able to adapt and live through whatever events going on. Now, critical infrastructures, again, getting back to what I was saying earlier, when we looked at the rollover to Y2K, we were looking at ways to prevent things. Just a couple of years prior to that, we had a very significant ice storm. And that was the Quebec and Ontario ice storm. And people lost power for a long period of time. And there was a long story, very short is, and I used to get out into the communities and I'd have to deal with all these people, and many of them were extremely upset for obvious reasons. They went without power for a long, long time. And they never talked about their own ability to withstand events like that, which would have been resiliency. They wondered why we couldn't protect from that. So fast forward, moving through the decades, or the decade, so to speak, Public Safety Canada, in implementing their national strategy, they started to put an awful lot of emphasis on the ability to withstand events, to be able to adapt to them and to recover from them. And so therein lies how this whole term in critical infrastructure, certainly in Canada and in many parts of the world, this evolved. So it's something relatively new. So as I was starting to say, is you can protect from certain levels of events. So there's a lot of frustration as to say, well, why can't you build your system or systems to withstand? And in fact, we do. We put in engineering standards and they were scrutinized. They far exceeded anything that was thought to have happened, and yet certain things do occur. But again, it comes down to resiliency is also the ability to respond. Okay, so I'll get to some definitions in a minute, but when you take a look at the electricity systems, it's actually built, as are some of the other critical infrastructures, they're built to withstand certain levels of disasters or types of events. But when they do fail, they're also, which you can't protect from everything, when they do fail, it's their ability to respond and recover. So again, these are things to do with resiliency. So let me put some context to that. When I started teaching in 2011, I had to put a concerted amount of time and effort into being able to express a lot of these concepts to students. So the popular, at least the popular and most predominant aspects of resiliency, I call them properties and dimensions. And these are very common, but to go over them, one of the ones that is probably foremost in most people's mind is the principle or the concept of redundancy. So redundancy is like alternate path. So an electricity system, it's like if you break one way, you can feed power the other way. If it's a highway system, there's more than one route to get to somewhere. So redundancy is alternate path, as I said. So that's one of the foremost properties or dimensions of resiliency. The second one is robustness. Now, robustness is just what it is. It's the strength. It's the ability or the strength of whatever's in place to withstand the effects. And then a third one is rapidity. Well, rapidity is again, it's about that your ability to respond and recover. Resourcefulness, your ability to think on your feet very quickly and to be very flexible and innovative. And then there's a fifth one that I've spent a fair amount of time on and conveying to students over the years, and that's about organizational learning. And one of the, that's a very good attribute into looking at entities that are very resilient. Highly reliable organizations, typically hospitals, are very resilient and again characterized by being highly reliable. They put in a lot of time and emphasis on ensuring that the people within their employment and other stakeholders can adapt to and recover from and respond to any type of events. So that's properties and dimensions of resiliency. So at this point, I'd like to say that it's again, to emphasize, it's not always possible to protect and prevent things, but your ability to respond to, recover, and adapt, all of those things are extremely important in ensuring for what I call reliability. Now, having all that, how do you know? What is the evidence? So if you're looking at resiliency, how do you know you're resilient? Is there evidence there? Typically, how you prove something's there is you measure it. And I'll talk about measurements in just a minute. But again, going back to the national strategy, Canada's national strategy, it's not unlike a lot of other countries, very similar type approaches, but it's all about the ability to have critical infrastructures as reliable as possible, but more importantly, or just as importantly, pardon me, have their citizens' have the ability to withstand the effects, at least for the short term, such that all the resources of the government and they can get in place and start to assist. So there was a lot of, just to digress a little bit here, there was a lot of reluctance at the beginning on national strategies, whether it was in Canada or around the world. They looked at it in terms, well, is this going to mean that we're going to have more regulations coming in place? The United States, the Americans, they typically have a lot more regulations than we do in Canada. So there's that kind of thinking that that would be in place. And one of the ways that would happen is you'd end up having these kind of standards where you had to measure up to them. So when you start to talk about resiliency and in terms of being able to measure it or demonstrated evidence of it, what I try and impress upon the students, and I often use electricity as the examples, but this is true in a lot of critical infrastructures. Measuring resiliency, you can take a look at it in terms of an historical context. Is your restoration and recovery times from one event to the next event, are they the same? Are they decreasing? You can look at it in terms of reduced failures, reduced failure probabilities. Many critical infrastructures, certainly electricity on the distribution, the low voltage side, those systems are put in place such that when they do fail, and they often fail from severe weather events and things like that, and much to people's dissatisfaction, there's many things that are put in place such that the impactor is not that long. So included in redundancy, which is alternate path, there's an awful lot of measures that put in place, such as to reduce the amount of time or to have the least amount of time possible to put the system back into place. So you can actually measure the reduced failure probabilities, the reduced interruptions, and reduced consequences. Now, and all of that makes sense. So take a look, and I did a study, actually I did a paper on this, on resiliency, and I took a look a lot at the occurrences of hurricanes in the United States, down in the Gulf and up the East Coast in particular. And you start to look at all the different hurricanes that come up there. And you look at the recovery time and, or return to restoration and all of the different things that go into it. And you start to think, well, okay, so if it's a hurricane category 1 and we're out of power for 8 hours, then the next time there's a category 1, it should be 8 hours. And you have to be careful of that because no two hurricanes or no two storms or no two disasters are the same. So there's a little bit of a problem here when you start to do measuring of resiliency. And sure enough, I just saw something, an article was about 2 years ago, and one of the jurisdictions in the United States is starting to say, well, we're going to start holding your feet to the fire here and saying, well, if a certain type storm comes through, you have X number of hours to be able to recover and restore to that. And so then how they got to that was obviously the measurements of the resiliency, and the things I talked about was the time to recover and the like. That can be very problematic, and we would not want to ever see critical infrastructures held to that level. Certainly if they started looking at it in terms of putting in penalties or sanctions, and that would be problematic.
So why would that be problematic?
Well,
As a consumer, I think it might be a good idea.
Well, and from a consumer's perspective, that is something. They say, well, they want rebates on their power bills, and in fact, recall just a short time ago, Rogers had an outage, and they actually gave a rebate. It's the first time I ever heard of a rebate they gave because their cell service had been out for the entire day. This is the type of stuff we're getting into. First off, most critical infrastructures services, they do not guarantee their service. Certainly in the power, we don't guarantee the power, the continuous supply of power. If you need a continuous supply of power, your resiliency to an interruption would be an uninterruptible power source. One of those small little units that kick in, or something that hooked into your house. Over the years, I spent a lot of time with people saying, well, the power went off and such did this type of damage to my computer systems and spoiled meat and things like that. People need to understand they need to have levels of resiliency if they need that level of 100% level of service. So why I'm saying all this is because now we're getting very sophisticated, so to speak, in looking at how resilient we are. Governments are looking at critical infrastructures, keeping in mind that critical infrastructures, by and large, are owned and operated by the private sector. The government, for the most part, is not in the business of providing essential goods and services. They do own and operate a lot of the road systems and bridges and certain other critical infrastructures. But when you take a look at airports and airlines and electricity and telecommunications, it's all owned and operated by the privite sector. So the government has a bit of a challenge here because they need to ensure for the citizens or society, right?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting area. So these companies are private sector companies, and yet one can argue that power is a public good.
It is.
So yeah, and so the relative roles between government in terms of controlling how it's run and what the levels of safety are versus private sector companies, there's a tension there because there are really different roles. The purpose of a company is mainly to make a profit for shareholders and so forth, whereas government has a different role. And I'm wondering, so somewhere there's a balance. I'm not sure where it is in terms of the degree that government should control what private sector companies do when they run public goods. Do you think, and I'm sure it's in different places in different parts of the world, where do you think that sweet spot is? Do you think we're there in Canada, or are other countries there? Are some doing a better job, a worse job?
To answer that, I'll answer it and start it this way, is when you take a look at essential goods and services over the past 20 years, we have become more reliant on pretty much everything. And the complexity of critical infrastructures are so interconnected, and the complexity of them on their own is such that a failure and the cascading effects can be absolutely disastrous. And it's never a single contingency that seems to hurt you. It's that cascading effect onto others. So when you look at it, it's a partnership, and that's why Canada, amongst other nations, have developed these national strategies to work in tandem with the critical infrastructure owners and operators, such that they can each provide their own level of expertise to make the critical infrastructures as resilient or protect as much as possible. So protection is still possible for a lot of things, and yet and yet we're increasingly seeing that protection is something that is um, um, even that can't be guaranteed. So the role of people and government is that the society looks at government to say, well, you need to have all these regulations in place. The regulations are very costly. So putting regulations in place puts in a burden as well, because all of that cost ends up going back to the consumers. So the more resilient we can make people, the better. The more resilient we can make entities, the better. So when you look at it, it's kind of this. First off, it starts out to be this kind of reluctance on owners and operators from the private sector wanting to work with governments, because they've got this suspicion that regulations are going to be putting in place. They don't want to share their vulnerabilities. In hindsight, I think if I was to see it done over again, I'd look at something more like how do you actually can you measure resiliency, and can you see that it's being enhanced? These are the things that I think are extremely important. So when you look at it and you say, okay, so if I'm a private sector company and I want to enhance my resiliency, there's a number of ways of doing that. First off, you obviously need to understand all the different risks and your vulnerabilities and risks. But if you start to reduce your vulnerabilities, you can increase your resiliency. So one of the primary ones that I like to focus on is you look at your interdependencies. So if you reduce your dependencies or your interdependencies, you can in fact increase your resiliency, because it's the failure of others and those cascading effects that can greatly harm your particular operation. So these are some of the things that are the government. They don't have the, pardon me, the mandate through laws for the most part. Certain critical infrastructures they do. When you take a look at the airline industry, I think that's the one with the highest level of angst for people when it comes to safety standards and those types of things, and the fear of flying. We take a look at the MAX Air issues and the like. Those are challenges that the individual entities themselves are faced with in public perception of being able to accept that level of risk. And governments in tune are looked at through the lens of people to say, well, you have to make these things more than resilient. We don't want to talk about resiliency when we're talking about certain critical infrastructures, such as safety on airlines.
How do you think Canada is doing overall compared to other parts of the world?
And it depends. When you take a look at certain critical infrastructures and certain hazards, it's easy to pick on the United States because they get focused on certain hazards, so to speak. The events of 9/11, they turned everything to terrorism, and then they got really blindsided by many hurricanes. So it's kind of a back and forth a lot. They got overly fixated with cyber, and then they had the events of the Boston Marathon bombing. And why I say that is because certain countries seem to have way more disasters than others. You take a look at New Zealand; they've had an awful lot of earthquakes and the like. You take a look at Canada; what have we had? Not to diminish the types of disasters that we've had. We've had the train disaster of 2014 when those people were killed in the middle of the night, and a number of train disasters, as a matter of fact. But when you take a look at natural disasters, well, we seem to get a lot of tornadoes. We certainly don't have the hurricanes. So how we are doing in terms of others, we had the blackout in 2003, and we had a number of smaller outages since that time. What we're all suffering from right now is the in the digital world, the hacking, the ransomware, and that's a good point of conversation, because you take a look at things and you say, well, initially the set of cybersecurity standards that came out in the early 2000s, extremely expensive. I know my role at Hydro One, and I helped put them in. It was millions upon millions of dollars for these rather simplistic cyber security standards, and they did the job. But the sophistication of the hackers and the ability for them to infiltrate critical infrastructures has grown to the point where they never had the ability to do the damage that they do now. So in fact, in the Ukraine in 2015 and 2016, it was alleged that the Russians are behind it, but they actually facilitated a couple of blackouts. So to be able to be resilient to that type of stuff, critical infrastructures have a hell of a challenge, because in fact, to respond to and recover from those events is really, really difficult. So I could go for a long time and tell you some of the different strategies that are going in place. But to emphasize my point about people's resiliency, again, it comes down to and in those, both of those, or at least in the first instance of the Ukraine power outage, it was during the middle of the winter. Complicating factors are people are going to freeze. It takes time to restore power. So it's kind of like opportunistic for hackers to do things in times of, let's just say, let me use the example now during the pandemic. We've seen an increased number of hacking or ransomware attacks on our digital systems. Our digital systems are so intertwined in our lives now that we literally can't do anything. We grind to a halt, do we not?
We do. I certainly do.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I read a science fiction novel. I forget what it's called now, but the scenario was a repeat of something like the Carrington event, except maybe worse.
Yes.
And it led, which is a severe solar storm, and it led to a massive global blackout, and then the world basically fell to pieces. And I've read different things about how well protected we are against another Carrington event. It's happened before, so we can only assume it will happen again. And I remember, you probably know better than I think the return period of it is in the order of a few hundred years or something like that.
Yeah, it's the periodicity. So again, this is things I was involved in my career at Hydro One. I was the lead for pandemic planning, and certainly came into play. I was the lead on the H1N1. And of course, when you take a look at that particular event, it never had the severity that was feared. So we had all these indicators, and the WHO level, pandemic level 6 was there. We met all that criteria, but the severity of the disease, no disrespect to people that actually died from it, but it was never turned out to be what certainly this particular pandemic was. And so there was a couple of things that happened early in the 2000s, and that was to do with people started looking at, okay, pandemics, and certainly the 1918 strain, we started looking at that, and there was an awful lot of hype, if not fear-mongering, about the bird flu. So we got to a level of preparedness that I thought was quite adequate, and it proved itself to be good in the H1N1, but we never kept up with it. And I don't want to take all the time talking about why we weren't as resilient as we could have been during this particular pandemic. It has to do with stockpiles and the like. But basically, at the same time, we started looking at it. It's funny where this came from. There was a movie coming out about severe solar storms, and it got the attention of some people in the United States, and they said, "Well, we need to start looking at severe solar storms as well." So I was involved in that initial study in the United States, but the unfortunate thing with that, there was the good part about that is they finally got academics and government and industry to work together, which was a positive. The problem with that is we started doing some worst case scenarios. So you mentioned the Carrington event, and they started doing some, I won't even call it modeling because that would be too generous, but they started doing some theorizing to say, well, if we had a Carrington level event, and certainly we've seen enough solar storms after that time, certainly more in the modern times, to see what the effects could be. The problem with that is certain entities hyped it and made a lot of noise pounding the table that said that an event, if it was to occur, we would be without power for years. And that was to do with certain assets not having the capability or capacity to build the things quick enough to replace them should an event occur. So that was early on. That was 2009, 2010. And that particular work still goes on to this day. My role in NATO, I was one of the group of experts that we looked at the effects of potential effects of severe solar weather on certain critical infrastructure, satellites. Mine was electricity, to name a few others. And we looked at that, and we looked at the potential, and we looked at the the type of planning that could go into place or needed to go into place, and we put through a list of recommendations. And so, as you can see, this type of stuff is ongoing, and certainly in the United States, that particular preparedness planning for severe weather, severe space weather storms is an ongoing project.
But
So
do you
could we
have
be
any
without
sense?
power for years? Not likely.
No, okay. That's what I was about to ask you, if you have a sense for what the actual impacts would be like. But to say, I guess it would really
Well,
depend
there's a lot of
on,
mitigation. Remember, resiliency is about putting in mitigation as well.
yeah,
So there's an awful lot. The interesting thing about Dave is when these studies start to come out and you start to look at all the different potential consequences, and you get the right people in the room, and you start to look at what's the desired level of resiliency or protection. And when you start putting all that stuff to paper, you really can come up with some really good measures, potential good measures. The difficulty is constraining people that like to hype events to the point, and I can't mention the man's name, he's a renowned scientist, but he obviously had a reason to say some of the things he did, which, yes, if we had a Carrington level event from 1852 or 53, whatever it was, I can't remember, whatever, doesn't matter. If we had an event like that, we'd be in a lot of trouble.
yeah.
But that'd be like, is it possible? Yes.
And in fact, if you wait long enough, it's probable. So,
Well,
so as an expert, when you say we probably won't be out of power for years, that's a scary thing for somebody to hear.
well, okay. So the reality is if you have an interruption, depending on what the cause is, okay, if it's severe weather, okay, we have a pretty good guess based on all the events that have occurred, what kind of severe weather and what kind of damage can be done. We even have a pretty good guess should a terrorist attack, because weather has some of the same consequences on certain assets as blowing it up from a terrorist attack. So we have some pretty good baseline, assumptions on that. What we don't have is some of the things, like you're saying, solar storms, severe solar storms. So there's geomagnetic induced current. And we've looked at it in terms of it coming out of those solar flares on what it would do to overheating high voltage transformers. So where we were highly vulnerable to begin with, to say we didn't have any spares of these high voltage transformers, okay, should the GICs hit. And so we've taken measures so that we could produce them at a quicker rate.
Okay.
So if we also had, when the problem with solar storms are, you get about a 20-minute window of a warning. Now, you could turn the power off. And if you turn the power off, you protect the asset, right? So if you turn off an asset, then it's no longer, in harm's way. And then you turn it back on. the problem is you turn the power off and people are going to be disadvantaged as well. So have we mitigated the potential for severe solar storms? I think we've done an excellent job in doing so. Now there's cascading consequences.
So just as an emergency manager, with a 20-minute warning, the notion that globally there would be an effective response in turning off power, I would put that in mythology as opposed
Well,
to
that would be, I want to clarify something here. That would be the worst case scenario. We actually know which transformers, which assets would be at risk. Okay. So you can absolutely do things to take them out of service and use your redundancy in other areas. Now, in the worst case scenario, the very, very worst case scenario, you would take it out of harm's way. But there's only certain assets. There's only certain assets that are vulnerable to the effects of severe solar storms, which is the geomagnetic induced current overheating of certain assets. So,
Okay.
and there's others too. I could get into all the technical things. This is why we did the study and why we wrote the report. And this is why the Americans are doing, and the Canadians in North America are doing the work they're doing, and why the European Union are doing the things that they're doing. So again, this is an ongoing, these types of things are ongoing now, and they will be continuous because we're always discovering new things. It used to be thought that countries at lower latitudes were not vulnerable to severe solar storms or the effects of GICs. And in fact, that's been disproven. So
well, a lot of
I hate to say it, but your doomsday scenario is probably, now, if we got hit with an Earth-sized meteor, okay, but we got a lot to worry about if something like that.
Yes, well, I guess some scenarios you just sort of pray and some things you can't do anything about.
No,
Yeah.
no. But I think overall, when you look at it's a shared responsibility, resiliency. So I've covered the 72-hour and the people, and it's the government's role to ensure that their citizens can and as much as possible be self-sufficient. And it's some work I did on just recently, and still it's just in the final stages here. On again, it's through NATO, as we took a look at again, I'm the electricity guy for them, and we took a look at developing guidelines, resiliency guidelines, which are baseline requirements. And why is that important? Well, NATO is, if those that know it, I'll just mention briefly, it's military for the most part, about 90% military, but there's a civil side as well. And a lot of critical infrastructures services are used by the military. So they have they don't have their own, certainly oil supplies. A lot of transportation is provided by the public sector and the like. So it's the military as well as the countries themselves that want to become as resilient as possible. Again, it's like that 72-hour thing. The military, is going to obviously want to protect their people, but they're also going to be in conflict if they're attacked. And obviously, there's a couple of adversaries that are come to mind without having to mention them. But why these guidelines are important is because you take a look at I don't want to call them best practices, but they're, for the most part, they're procedures and procedures and practices, I guess, in the sense that, if countries do this type of business with their critical infrastructures, they can become more resilient to all kinds of threats and hazards. So again, it's this kind of guidance that goes out there such that everybody starts to look at, redundancy. They look at their ability to provide alternate means or alternate paths. They look at their own resourcefulness and certainly the robustness and strength of how they manage their critical infrastructure. So these guidelines are an important part of the overall NATO mission. And as I said, they're just being implemented around now.
So I'd like to wind this up with just one final question. If the entire world came to you, Dave Baumken, and said, we're going to do whatever you say around critical infrastructure, what recommendation would you make?
Well, that's a loaded question, because there's a difference between natural disasters, which is having all the things that come to your mind, the 72-hour kit. But to me, the greatest threat to our society right now is on the digital side, and that has everything to do with people's data. People really need to understand what they're doing with social media, and that's a loaded question in itself. But personal protection of data is something the governments need to do a better job on. People need to be much more wary of this to ensure their own resiliency, because it is no longer something that can be prevented. Hacking and abuse by adversaries, criminals, nation states, it's an ongoing concern, and you can see it in the news about the different things about failures, ransomware, and be self-sufficient without your device.
Okay, that I am actually quite reliant upon, to tell you the truth. So David, I'd like to thank you very much for giving us your time and your thoughts and sharing your experience on this really important topic.
You're welcome.